There is nothing better than homemade bread. Am I right? I just remember my mom and my grandma making homemade bread all the time. But who has time to even make homemade bread these days? I definitely don't, because I'm a working mom, I'm also a student, and so time is very precious. The secret to making homemade bread on a weekly basis is to keep it simple. Yes, absolutely, as simple as can be is where we can thrive. I don't do anything fancy because I don't have the time for it. I think sourdough is beautiful, and I am so jealous of people who can make it look like a work of art, but I don't do that. I don't have the time to do that. So I do the absolute bare minimum, and it turns out amazing every single time. I'm gonna show you the simplest and easiest way to make homemade sourdough bread. To start off, I'm gonna go ahead and grab out my sourdough starter from my fridge. I like to dump out just a little bit of liquid on the top. I just think it's gross. You can mix it in, but I just dump it out. And then you have your starter. With this, you are going to increase how much you have. You're going to do it in a 1-to-1 ratio. So I start out by putting my bowl on my scale, and then I will tare it to 0. I use bread flour for mine. I used unbleached organic. And then you also need some water, and then you need your starter. And those are all the components that you need to make more starters. So I'm going to pull out my starter, just kind of scoop it into the bowl. And I typically like to do 100 grams. So that gives me about enough for like a loaf to do every week. And I just only need a loaf for me and my family. So I'll do 100 grams of starter. Then I'm going to add the 100 grams of water. And then I just mix that all together, let the starter somewhat dissolve into the water. I'm going to 0 it again, and then add 100 grams of bread flour. And if I get a little too much, then I'll put it right back. And then I'm going to mix all of this up together. At this point, it's going to kind of look like really shaggy kind of dough, but it's not quite a bread dough. And then I'm just going to pop it in my fridge and let it sit overnight. So the next morning, I'm actually going to make the dough. You could also wait an extra day if you needed to. I like to grab a big bowl, so that way I have enough space for everything. The great thing about sourdough is you just measure everything out, and honestly, measuring everything out means that the measurements are much more accurate than using cups like we do in America. I'm going to 0 everything out to begin with, and the first thing that I will add to my dough is some of my starter. And I personally find that if you leave the starter on the counter to like activate it, it will be much more sour of a dough, and I don't like super sourdough. So I will just keep it in my fridge, and it slows down the reaction, so it's less soury when the bread tastes like an in-between of like true sourdough and regular bread from the store. So I'll do 150 grams of my sourdough starter. And then I'm going to add to that my water, and I just warm this water a little bit in the microwave before I add it. It's about 250 grams. I'm going to add that to my bowl. Then I also am going to add 25 grams of oil. And at this point, I just like to mix everything together to have the starter dissolve into the water and kind of combine everything. I'm using my Dutch whisk here to do that. Dutch whisks I feel like are really, really good for doughs, especially like more wet doughs, which sourdough is typically a more wet dough. I've gone ahead and mixed that up, and then I'm going to add my dry ingredients. So this recipe calls for 500 grams of bread flour. And then I have a little bit of salt that goes in. It's about 10 grams of salt. And then I'm just going to use my whisk to mix everything together and get it combined and scrape down the sides. It's a little bit difficult because it is a very shaggy dough, but that's normal. So now I'm just kind of combining everything because there's some little pieces at the bottom. Then you take that and cover it with a damp cloth for like 30 minutes to an hour to autolyze it. That just helps all the reactions to start and break things down. So now that it's autolyzed, it's ready to actually get kind of formed into a ball. I literally just do this in my hand. I don't do anything fancy. I just kind of squish it together and kind of tuck the edges under and then put it right back in the same bowl. You can cover it with plastic wrap or a damp cloth, or I just got a cover for Christmas. I think the damp cloth actually works a little bit better than the plastic, and I think the cover will be really nice too. It just helps to keep moisture in. So this part is optional because what you can do is you can do a series of stretches and folds. Basically, it's just tugging on the dough, folding it in on itself. And this really helps with generating height. And so you can do it a couple different times. You can do it every hour, every 30 minutes. You can do it a couple of times. You don't even have to do it. I've done it plenty of times without doing it, and it's turned out just fine. After letting it sit, it's rising. You can tell it's definitely a lot bigger. The dough is really a more cohesive whole. So it's nearly ready to bake. So I'm just going to pull it out of this bowl, kind of get it all together. And then I just kind of, again, fold it, tuck the edges under to kind of fold it into a loaf. And then this is what I'm going to put in my Dutch oven. I always put parchment paper in there and just plop it in. A little bit into my rise is when I'm going to start my oven. So you initially heat it to 450 degrees. And that's what you're going to set it to preheat. So at this point, your dough's risen a little bit. I literally just take a serrated knife and cut it. Again, this is a lazy girl's guide, so you can use it however you want. It's really not that big of a deal. It's just bread to eat. This is just for my family. I'm not making it pretty for anybody or anything in particular. So I just cut it with a serrated knife. And then I'm going to drop the temperature down to 400, and that's the temperature it's actually going to bake at. And then I'm going to put the lid on and put the Dutch oven in the oven, and this is going to bake for 20 minutes with the lid on. Once the 20 minutes is up, I'm just going to take the lid out and then let it continue baking for another 40 minutes. This is just to give you an idea of how it will look at that midway point. And then 40 minutes later, your sourdough is done and ready to come out of the oven. It's going to smell so good. I have left my sourdough in my Dutch oven overnight. I take it out immediately. I've done it every way. It really doesn't matter, but you're done. A sourdough routine is successful because it relies on the spaced time approach. You have to break up the steps little by little over a long period of time to make a sourdough. And because of that, that works way better for my life because it offers the flexibility that a standard yeast bread doesn't. I can make a sourdough over a weekend because it doesn't mean that after so many hours it has to be baked. You can leave sourdough to sit for quite a long time before you actually have to bake it. Sourdough comes together little by little, but it comes together to create the perfect staple for your kitchen. I hope seeing how easy it is to actually make a sourdough on a daily basis makes you a lot more inclined to start, makes it a little less daunting, and hopefully you're able to find a good sourdough routine for you that allows you to have some yummy, fresh, homemade bread every single week without the hassle of dedicating hours upon hours to making it happen. I'm going to leave the recipe in the description box below so that you can check out the recipe. It's tried and true, works every time. It is so good and so easy. If you have any questions about troubleshooting stuff with the recipe or with sourdough, let me know down below in the comments, because I have learned a lot of things as I have used this recipe for a long time on how to tweak little bits here and there. So let me know if you have any questions, and I cannot wait to see and hear how your sourdough turns out.